Salvete discipuli, and welcome to part 2 as we discuss the tempus perfectum, the perfect tense. Here we'll discuss how we actually conjugate the perfect tense, how we translate the perfect tense, and go through a few practice examples for IDing the person, number, and how we translate. Before we begin, let's go ahead and go through our necessary vocab. You guys know that a verb is an action or a state of being. It has person, it has number to tell us how many and who is doing the action. It has a tense as well for when the action takes place. When we're talking about tense when the action takes place, so far we know the present tense, tu magistram audis, you are listening to the teacher in the present time, as opposed to the imperfect, one of our past tenses, tu in scuola eras, you were in school yesterday. The future tense we also know, tu craseros iubebes, tomorrow you will order the slaves. This action hasn't happened yet, it'll happen in the future. And then finally we're beginning to learn our perfect tense, our other past tense, for one action in the past that is over and done with. Tu in villa amicae pernoctavisti, you stayed the night at a friend's house, but then you didn't stay the night again. You did it just once in the past. When we're talking about person, we have first, second, and third person to describe who is doing the action. First person singular I, second person you, third person singular he, she, or it, or any type of singular noun. And then going on into the plurals, the first person we, the second person you all, and the third person they, or some sort of plural noun. In the present tense, our endings are ost, mus, tis, nt for I, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, and they in the present tense. When we switch over to that repeated past action, the imperfect tense, our endings are bam, bas, bat, bamus, batis, and bant. And then finally, we have two different ways to conjugate verbs for person and number in the future tense, bo, bis, bit, bimus, bitis, and bunt, and this is for verbs that are first or second conjugation. And then for third conjugation verbs, we also have the ace, et, amus, atis, and ent endings to indicate I, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, and they. And just a reminder that all of the tenses that we have studied so far are going to be using your principal parts 1 and 2 to form these verbs before we add those endings to it. The tempus perfectum, on the other hand, as we discussed previously, it's going to use this new third principal part, the one that has all of those spelling changes, the V's, the S's, the X's, macrons, and reduplication. And this translation, it's again going to be in the past tense. We're going to translate it as just verbed or has or have verbed with the helping verbs has or haved. These translations indicate not only past tense, but that it only happened one time, such as yesterday, I walked the dog. I didn't walk the dog 3, 4, 5 times yesterday, as would be indicated by the imperfect tense, I was walking. Instead, I walked the dog. It happened in the past, but only once, and then that action was completed and done with. When we conjugate the tempus perfectum, the perfect tense, we need to start with this third principal part, and our first step is going to be to drop that part down. We talked about how this is the first person singular of the perfect tense, so we're just going to drop that down, and amawi means in the perfect tense, I loved. Next, we need to find our base, and to find our base, we're going to take off the ending from our third principal part. The I is our ending for the I form, and we are left with the base amaw. Now that V is part of our important spelling change that's going to help us recognize the third principal part that we use for the perfect tense. So we need to make sure that our base includes that V spelling change or whatever other spelling change we find in the third principal part. Finally, we're going to add the rest of our endings. And be prepared, discipuli, these endings are a little different than the ones that you are used to. I, isti, it, imus, istis, and erunt. Now, the nice thing is that we do have some similarities between these new endings and the endings that we knew for our other tenses as we're looking about the person and who's doing the action. In the second person, we do have an S to help indicate the you form. There is a T still in the third person singular, but notice that it's going to have this I before it. We do still have the moose for the first person plural with an I in front of it, a tis in the second person, and then an NT in the third person plural. However, with all of these endings, there are a lot more I's in front of our endings than before, and some other additions as well. To help you remember these endings disciply, we have the perfect tense song, and this is in thanks to one of my students, Destiny Swagger, who came up with this. It's to the tune of Frère Jacques. Perfect tense, I ist die it, I ist die it. Imus ist es erunt, imus ist es erunt. It happened once, once then done. So this song not only teaches you what the tense is, what the endings are, but it also reminds you that it's a past tense action that only happened once as compared to the imperfect tense, which happens repeatedly in the past. A nota bene discipli on the irregular verbs, they are all completely regular in the perfect tense. You're going to form them the exact same way that you form any other verb. Start with that third principal part. Let's take a look at some of these. We have sum esse and possum posse. As you can see, we're using that third principal part, dropping it down, finding our base fu, and then adding to that base all of our perfect tense endings. I, isti, it. Imus, istis, and erunt. Possum posse is formed the exact same way using the third principal part, just adding our endings to that base. And luckily for us, the other four irregular verbs in level 2 are formed the exact same way. They are all completely normal. Let's take a look at volo and nolo using the third principal part and adding the endings I, isti, it, imus, istis, and erunt. And then for the verbs eo and ire, once again, we're using that third principal part and then adding our endings I, isti, it, imus, istis, and erunt. The only odd thing that we have with our irregulars comes with eo, ire, and that is because sometimes it has that V in the third principal part. Other times it's just two I's, so it would be ii, iisti, it, imus, istis, and erunt, but it could also be iwi, iwisti, iwit, iwimus, iwistis, iwerunt. Otherwise, happy news, you don't need to remember any weird forms for our regular verbs in the perfect tense. From here on out, your irregular verbs are actually completely normal. Eogapai. Discipli, I'd like you to take a moment to practice identifying the person and number of some perfect tense verbs. Your choices will be first, second, or third person, and then singular or plural. So as an example, here we have userunt, and based on the ending that we have, we can identify this as a third person plural verb. Now, I've also provided the dictionary entry of the verbs because later on you'll be practicing translating these in the completed past action. But for right now, go through these verbs and identify the person and number, and go ahead and pause the video while you do this. Here you can check your work to see if you've correctly identified all of the various endings, and I'm going to underline the endings to help you pinpoint exactly where the persons and number that I've identified on the board came from. Discipli, as we continue on in our practice with the perfect tense, this time we're going to use those exact same verbs and we're going to translate them according to the perfect tense. Remember that they need to be translated as verbed or has or have verbed depending on the person and number. And here once again we have our example, userunt, which we previously identified as being the third person plural, which is the they form. So we're going to say they ordered in the past. They ordered. Go ahead and go through for the remainder of these verbs, and I've given you their meanings here in case you're still having some trouble recognizing what verb it is based on the third principal part. Go ahead and pause your video as you practice. And you can see the answers on the board in the past tense. For the most part, we're just going to be adding EDs to our verbs. However, watch out because in English we do have some very irregular past tense options. So keep in mind that verb is really just your clue that you need to translate it with whatever the past tense of that English verb is.